The five friends, Alex, Jessica, Mike, Rachel, and Chris, were eager to get away from the city. They had talked about this camping trip for months, imagining nights under the stars, laughter around the campfire, and the freedom that comes with escaping the noise of the modern world. Alex, the de facto leader of the group, had found the spot, a forest so remote it wasn't even on most maps. No one had camped there in years, maybe ever, he had said with a grin. The drive to the forest had been longer than expected. The road narrowed until it became little more than a dirt track winding through the trees, the towering pines casting long shadows in the fading evening light. When they finally pulled up to the clearing at the forest's edge, the sun was low, turning the sky a deep orange, the last warm color they'd see for days. They unloaded the tents quickly, eager to set up before nightfall. The ground was tough, harder than it should have been for a place that looked so lush. As Alex hammered the last peg into the earth, he felt something odd beneath his foot, but it was getting dark and he shrugged it off. Behind him, Mike called out, laughing about how the spot seemed like something from an old horror movie, isolated, with not a soul for miles. What none of them saw, half buried under the leaves and dirt near the tree line, was the old stone marker, worn smooth by time. The names etched into it were faint, almost invisible now, but still there, a silent reminder of the dead that lay beneath. The air in the clearing was heavy, not just the humidity of the late summer forest, but something else, something they couldn't quite place. As they built the fire and gathered around it, the mood was light, though a creeping sense of unease gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. The forest, dense and dark, loomed around them like a wall, swallowing the last rays of light. Rachel was the first to mention the silence. "You guys hear that?" she asked, her voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. Or more like, "Not hear that?" The others paused, listening. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. No birds, no rustling of leaves, no insects buzzing in the night, just the popping of the fire and their own breathing. Mike laughed, shaking his head. "It's just quiet. We're in the middle of nowhere. What did you expect? Sirens?" But the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong, the kind of wrong that makes your skin prickle and the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They tried to shake it off, telling ghost stories as the firelight flickered in their faces, but no one noticed how quickly the night grew colder, how the shadows from the trees seemed to creep closer. As the fire began to die down, Chris, who had been quiet all evening, stood up, glancing toward the forest. "I think I heard something," he muttered, but when they listened, all they could hear was the silence. Just the heavy, suffocating silence that wrapped around the clearing like a shroud. "Let's just call it a night," Alex said, trying to brush off the tension. They climbed into their tents, leaving the fire to burn down to embers. As the last light faded, none of them realized that they had already disturbed something ancient, something that had been waiting. The night wrapped itself around the campsite like a heavy, impenetrable fog. Inside their tents, the friends tried to sleep, but the quiet gnawed at their nerves. It wasn't just the usual forest silence. It was a silence that felt alive, like the forest was holding its breath, watching them. The kind of quiet that crawls under your skin and makes your mind race with thoughts you can't quite shake. Jessica was the first to stir. Lying in her sleeping bag, she stared at the canvas roof of the tent, the fire's last glow casting faint shadows. She couldn't understand why, but her heart was pounding. It wasn't the cold, she had layered up for that, but there was a sense of something off. A prickle at the edge of her awareness, as if someone was standing just outside her tent, waiting, listening. Then it started, the soft crunch of footsteps in the leaves outside. At first, Jessica told herself it was just an animal. The woods were full of them, after all, but the steps were too deliberate, too steady, like someone walking in slow circles around the tents. They stopped, then started again, closer this time. Jessica held her breath, her eyes wide, straining to hear. Was it one of the others? Alex, maybe? But then she heard it, faint whispers, too low to understand, like a conversation carried on the wind. Except there was no wind. She lay still, her hand gripping her sleeping bag, wondering if she should get up, if she should check, but a deep, primal part of her told her not to move, not to breathe. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, circling her tent once, twice, then stopped. A heavy, thick silence followed, so deep it felt like the air itself had frozen. In the tent next to her, Mike had heard it too. He lay awake, staring at the thin walls of the tent, trying to convince himself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on them. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had seen something earlier when he stepped out to check on the fire, a figure standing near the oak tree at the edge of the clearing. He had only caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of his eye, but he was sure it had been there. He remembered squinting through the darkness, stepping closer, calling out, "Hello?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, a shadow against the backdrop of the woods. When Mike approached, I am. It had vanished, melting into the trees without a sound. He had laughed it off when he returned to the fire, telling the others it was just his imagination. But now, lying in his tent, he wasn't so sure. The whispers outside grew more insistent, almost like chanting, just on the edge of hearing. He wanted to open the tent flap and look, but something deep in his chest told him not to. So he waited, eyes wide, every muscle tense, listening to the low murmurs that seemed to surround them. In Rachel's tent, she too was awake. The stillness was suffocating, the air thick with tension. She had this awful sensation of being watched, as if unseen eyes were fixed on her from somewhere in the dark. The silence outside wasn't natural. It was the kind of quiet that makes your bones ache, a silence too deep, too complete. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the clearing, the sound of a branch breaking underfoot. Rachel sat bolt upright, her heart hammering in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Jessica, who was still frozen in her sleeping bag. "I thought I heard something earlier," Jessica muttered back, her voice shaking. "It's probably just Mike or Alex," Rachel tried to reassure herself, though the fear gnawing at her insides told her she didn't believe it. Meanwhile, Alex was the only one who had managed to fall asleep, but his sleep was restless. In his dreams, he saw the oak tree again, standing tall and ominous at the edge of the camp. But this time, something was wrong. Its branches twisted unnaturally, reaching toward the ground, the roots digging deep into the earth like claws. And beneath the tree, he saw faces, faint, blurry, but there, staring up at him with hollow, empty eyes. Alex jolted awake, gasping, his heart racing. The tent was dark, but he could feel the suffocating weight of the silence pressing down on him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. Outside, the night had grown colder. The fire was nothing but a dim glow of dying embers, and the whispers had faded into the trees, leaving only the sound of the occasional crackling wood. But in the distance, just at the edge of the clearing, something shifted in the shadows, moving silently through the trees. None of them slept well that night. By the time the morning sun cut through the dense trees, none of them had slept more than a few uneasy hours. They gathered around the dying embers of the fire, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke of the strange sounds they had heard during the night, the whispers that seemed to follow them, or the shifting shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was as if acknowledging it would make it too real, too dangerous. So they packed up their breakfast in silence, all secretly eager to get out of the thick, suffocating air of the forest. By mid-morning, Alex suggested they explore deeper into the woods. He thought a hike would help distract them from the strange atmosphere of the campsite, but the others were hesitant. Rachel especially felt an oppressive weight hanging over them. She didn't know why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was watching them from the shadows. Still, they went. The forest was dense, its canopy so thick that even in daylight, the woods felt dim and claustrophobic. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, covered in thick roots and moss that seemed to tangle them at every step. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the landscape became. Trees twisted in unnatural shapes, their bark gnarled and rough like knotted flesh. After nearly an hour of walking, it was Jessica who first stumbled on something unusual. She had tripped on a large stone sticking up from the undergrowth, half hidden by moss and leaves. Cursing under her breath, she brushed away the dirt with her hands, revealing the smooth surface of the stone beneath. But as she cleared more of it, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a stone, it was a grave marker. "What the hell?" she muttered, stepping back as the others gathered around. Alex knelt beside her, wiping away more of the moss. The stone was weathered and cracked, the lettering faint but still legible. It was an old, forgotten gravestone, The dates etched into the stone were from over 100 years ago. "This is a cemetery," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. The realization hit them all at once, the weight of it pressing down on them like a dark, suffocating cloud. As they spread out, more stones began to appear, half buried and broken, scattered across the forest floor like bones. Some were nothing more than fragments, worn smooth by time, but others had clearer inscriptions, names, dates, epitaphs, all marking the final resting places of people who had long since been forgotten. "How many are there?" Mike asked, his voice tight with unease. He glanced around, suddenly aware of how silent the forest had become again, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. Rachel's stomach churned. The quiet felt heavier now, more oppressive, like the forest itself was listening. "We should go back," she said quickly, her voice rising with fear. "We're camping on graves." "They're just stones," Alex said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's not like there's anything here anymore." But even as he said it, he could feel it. The ground beneath them didn't feel right. There was a strange stillness to it, as if the earth hadn't moved in decades. No birds, no insects, no signs of life, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. Chris, who had been silent throughout the discovery, stood a few feet away, staring down at a particular gravestone. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a distant, haunted look. "Chris, you okay?" Jessica asked, stepping toward him. He didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the weathered stone at his feet. Then, in a low, hollow voice, he said, "I had a dream last night. I was buried. I could feel the dirt pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe, and I kept hearing voices, calling out to me." The group fell silent, a chill creeping through them. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, the air growing cold and still. The cemetery felt less like a forgotten place and more like a place that had been waiting for someone to disturb it. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice firm. She was no longer just uneasy, she was terrified. Every instinct screamed that they had made a mistake coming here. "Let's go back to the camp," Alex agreed, his resolve finally breaking. "We'll pack up and leave first thing in the morning." But as they turned to make their way back, something in the atmosphere shifted. The sunlight seemed weaker, the forest darker than before. And though none of them said it aloud, they could all feel it, the eyes of the forgotten, watching them from the shadows. As they retraced their steps, Chris lingered at the edge of the group, glancing back toward the graves every few steps. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. He hadn't mentioned it to the others, but he swore he heard someone whisper his name back at the cemetery, just before they left. The voice had been soft, distant, like it was coming from beneath the ground. As they made their way back to the camp, the tension between the friends grew thick and uncomfortable. No one spoke, but each step felt heavier than the last. The forest seemed to stretch, growing denser, darker, as if they were walking into the heart of something ancient. The air around them was suffocating, colder than it had been just hours before. Even the sunlight, which had been filtering through the canopy, seemed to weaken, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally. Back at camp, Rachel was the first to break the silence. "We should have never come here," she muttered, her voice shaky. She wiped her forehead, though the cold made the sweat feel clammy and wrong. "I knew something wasn't right." Jessica, her face pale and drawn, nodded. "Why would anyone bury people out here in the middle of nowhere? It doesn't make sense." Chris sat apart from the others, staring into the distance. His eyes were vacant, his face gaunt, like he hadn't slept in days. When Jessica asked him if he was okay, he only nodded once, slowly. But something about the way he looked through her, not at her, sent a chill down her spine. As they began to prepare for the night, no one could ignore the subtle changes in the atmosphere around them. The fire, which they had restarted, flickered unnaturally, the flames bending as if pushed by a wind that none of them could feel. The woods around them had fallen into a silence so deep it seemed unnatural. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the heavy weight of stillness pressing down on them. And then there were the smells, faint at first, like damp earth and old wood. But as the evening wore on, the scent grew stronger, more pungent. It smelled of decay, of something rotting just beneath the surface. Rachel wrinkled her nose, glancing around nervously. "Do you guys smell that?" They all did. It was a thick, cloying odor that seemed to cling to the air, wrapping around them like an invisible fog. Mike looked toward the trees, his brow furrowed. Something must have died out there, maybe an animal or something. But they all knew that wasn't it. The smell wasn't natural, it was old, ancient, like the breath of the earth itself had turned foul. As the night crept closer, Chris grew increasingly withdrawn. His eyes darted toward the tree line, his fingers digging into the dirt as if he was trying to ground himself. Jessica watched him with growing concern, noticing how he shivered despite the warmth of the fire. I don't think it's safe to stay here tonight," Rachel whispered to Alex. She was barely holding it together, her voice trembling. "We should leave now." "We'll leave in the morning," Alex said, though even he didn't sound convinced. "We don't know these woods, and it's too dangerous to hike in the dark." But as he spoke, Chris finally broke his silence. "They don't want us to leave," Chris said softly, almost to himself. His eyes, hollow and distant, flickered with a strange light. "Not yet, they're still waiting." Everyone turned to look at him. "What are you talking about?" Jessica asked, her voice low, as if she was afraid of the answer. Chris didn't respond at first. He simply stared into the fire, his lips moving as if he were silently counting. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like his own, he muttered, "I heard them. Last night. When you were all asleep. They told me things. Things I can't repeat." "Chris, what the hell are you talking about?" Alex demanded, standing up. But Chris didn't answer. Instead, he stood slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural, like someone trying to move while being pulled by invisible strings. Without another word, he walked toward the edge of the campsite, his eyes fixed on the oak tree that loomed over the clearing. Rachel and Mike exchanged uneasy glances. "Chris!" Rachel called out, her voice wavering. But he didn't stop. He just kept walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond the campfire's reach. "Go after him," Jessica urged, her voice thick with panic. Alex grabbed a flashlight and ran after him, with Mike right behind. The beam of the light cut through the dark, casting strange, warped shadows as they followed Chris into the woods. They found him standing under the old oak tree, his hands digging into the earth at its base. His fingers were caked with dirt, his nails cracked and bloody, but he didn't seem to notice. His breath came in shallow gasps as he muttered under his breath, words too low to hear. "Chris, stop!" Alex shouted, grabbing his arm. But when Chris turned to face them, his eyes were wide with terror, and his voice was barely a whisper. "They're under here. They're buried here." Alex's blood ran cold. For the first time since they arrived, he understood the depth of the mistake they had made. The gravestones, the whispers, the strange smells. It was all connected. The dead hadn't left this place, and now they were waking. The air grew heavier as the night deepened, the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down on the group. They sat huddled around the fire, the flames casting jittery, dancing shadows on their pale faces. Despite the blaze, the cold gnawed at them, creeping into their bones. The kind of cold that came not from the temperature, but from something far older, something unseen. Chris had been silent since Alex and Mike dragged him back from the oak tree. His hands were caked in dirt, his fingers bloodied from clawing at the ground, but he didn't seem to notice. He sat apart from the others, staring into the distance with vacant right eyes. Every now and then he muttered to himself, fragments of words that made no sense. "They're coming, still waiting, buried deep." Rachel tried to keep herself calm, but fear twisted her stomach into knots. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was just beyond the trees lurking in the dark. The strange smells had returned too, more pungent now, the stench of decay thick in the air. She could barely keep herself from gagging. "We need to leave now," she said firmly, her voice tight with panic. "Chris isn't right. Something's wrong with him. This place, it's not safe." Jessica nodded, her face pale. "I agree, he's been acting so weird. This whole place is wrong." Alex shook his head, but his confidence was unraveling. "We can't hike through the woods at night. It's too dangerous." "More dangerous than staying here," Mike shot back, his voice rising. He glanced over at Chris, who was still sitting apart, rocking slightly. "He needs help. I think he's losing it." As they argued, the forest around them seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The firelight flickered unnaturally, casting long, distorted shadows that made the clearing feel smaller. tighter. It was as if the forest was shrinking, pushing them towards something dark and inevitable. Suddenly, Chris stood up without a word. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical, like he was being pulled by some unseen force. Without a glance at the others, he walked toward the edge of the clearing, his steps slow but deliberate. "Chris, where are you going?" Jessica called, her voice thick with dread. But Chris didn't respond. He kept walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. "Chris!" Alex shouted, leaping to his feet. He grabbed a flashlight and ran after him. But when the beam of the light cut through the trees, Chris was already gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Panic surged through the group. Alex, Mike, and Jessica grabbed their flashlights and scrambled to follow, their lights flickering as they moved deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around them, the path twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Every step felt like they were being drawn into a maze, the forest warping, pulling them in. "Chris!" Alex yelled, his voice echoing through the trees. But no answer came. Only the heavy, oppressive silence, broken by the crunch of leaves under their feet and the occasional snap of a twig. As they moved deeper, the air grew colder, the smell of rot intensifying. Jessica gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve, but it did little to block out the stench. It smelled like something long dead, buried deep beneath the earth but still breathing. Then, without warning, the beam of Mike's flashlight caught something, a figure standing motionless just ahead. For a moment, they thought it was Chris, but as they got closer, their hearts sank. It wasn't Chris at all. It was a shadow, a dark, twisted shape that barely resembled a person, standing perfectly still between two trees. Its form was warped, elongated, as if it had been stretched and pulled into something grotesque. The figure had no face, only a hollow black void where its features should have been, and its body seemed to melt into the darkness around it. "Do you see that?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Jesus Christ," Alex muttered, his breath shallow. Suddenly the figure moved, just slightly, but enough for them to see it wasn't a trick of the light. It shifted, almost gliding through the trees, disappearing into the shadows like smoke. And then, from somewhere far deeper in the woods, they heard Chris's voice. But it wasn't his usual voice. It was distant, hollow, like it was coming from far beneath the ground. "Help me!" They all froze. "Did you hear that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "It sounded like..." Mike started but trailed off. It had sounded like Chris, but wrong. It was the kind of voice that echoed in nightmares, the kind that lingered long after you woke up in a cold sweat. "We have to find him," Alex said, though his voice wavered. They pressed on, deeper into the woods, their lights flickering as if struggling against the darkness. The trees seemed to twist and warp around them, closing in tighter, the air thick with the stench of rot and earth. Their breaths came in short gasps, fear clinging to them like a second skin. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went still. The forest fell into an unnatural silence, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Chris was gone. They called for him again and again, their voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. No movement, no sign of life. Alex's flashlight flickered out, and as he fumbled to get it working again, something caught Jessica's eye. On the ground, near the base of a tree, was a small object, Chris's watch. It was half buried in the dirt, the strap snapped as if torn from his wrist. "We need to go back," Mike said. His voice tight with panic, "but we can't keep searching in the dark." Reluctantly, they retreated to the camp, but the fear that Chris was lost to them forever hung heavy in the air. The fire had died down to embers, barely lighting the clearing. The woods around them felt like they were closing in, pressing in tighter with every passing moment. As they sat huddled around the dying fire, no one spoke. Chris was gone, swallowed by the forest, and with him, the last traces of safety. The trees around them seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching down like twisted, skeletal arms. And in the distance, just at the edge of the clearing, something moved. Watching, waiting. The final night descended on the campsite like a suffocating shroud, wrapping the group in its oppressive darkness. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, casting the faintest light over the clearing, but it wasn't enough to chase away the cold. The temperature had dropped sharply, more than it should have for a late summer night. It felt unnatural, bone-chilling, like the earth beneath them had turned to ice. Rachel sat closest to the fire, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, eyes darting between the dark outlines of the trees. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every rustling leaf felt like something creeping closer. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Chris was still gone, and the forest, now more than ever, felt alive, watching, waiting. Jessica was beside her, visibly shaking. "He's not coming back, is he?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No one answered her. Alex and Mike stood a few feet away, staring into the woods with flashlights in hand. But the beams barely penetrated the thick wall of darkness surrounding them. It was as if the trees were pressing in closer, encroaching on their small patch of light. And in the distance, the strange shadows they had seen before moved again, slithering between the trees, always just out of reach. "We need to stick together," Alex said, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced back at the others, his eyes wide with fear. "If we just wait until morning, we can make it out of here." Rachel wasn't so sure. Morning seemed so far away, and the night had a strange weight to it, like time itself had slowed. The hours stretched out, long and unbearable, every minute feeling like a lifetime. And then there were the voices, faint, distant, like whispers carried on the wind. Sometimes it was Chris's voice, calling from somewhere deep in the woods. Other times it was an unfamiliar voice, a chorus of murmurs that seemed to rise up from the earth itself. Jessica suddenly stood, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" Rachel strained to listen, but there was only silence. "What?" "I swear I heard." "It was Chris," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "He was calling for help." "No," Mike snapped, his voice sharp with fear. "It's not him. It's not Chris. Whatever's out there, it's using his voice." Before anyone could stop her, Jessica took off toward the tree line, her flashlight bobbing erratically in the dark. "Chris," she screamed, her voice desperate. "Chris, where are you?" "Jessica, stop!" Alex ran after her, his flashlight shaking as he chased her into the woods. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and gnarled branches that seemed to reach out for them. But Jessica didn't slow down. She was driven by a frantic hope that her friend was still alive, that they could save him. Rachel and Mike were left behind, the fire casting eerie shadows on their faces. The silence stretched, unbearable, until they heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness just beyond the clearing. It was unlike anything they'd heard before, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground, making their skin crawl. Rachel's eyes darted toward the sound, her stomach twisting in terror. What the hell was that? Mike was frozen, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "I don't know," he whispered, barely able to speak. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the growl came again, closer this time. And then, from the shadows, something stepped into the edge of the firelight. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and thin, bending at strange angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, if they were eyes, were hollow, black voids, staring at them with an intensity that chilled their blood. The figure stood still for a moment, watching them, before it began to move. Slowly it glided forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it was being carried by the darkness itself. Rachel and Mike were frozen, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. This wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something far older, something from the earth itself, awakened by their presence, by their disturbance of the graves. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Every instinct screamed to run, but her legs refused to obey. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if studying them, and then it took another step forward. The air grew colder, the smell of decay overwhelming. Just then they heard a scream, Jessica's scream, piercing the night like a blade. Mike bolted toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Rachel followed, her heart pounding in her ears, the terror propelling her forward. As they ran, the trees twisted around them, their roots seeming to rise up, trying to trip them, slow them down. The forest was alive, angry, trying to keep them trapped. They burst into a small clearing, and there, lying in the dirt, was Jessica. Her flashlight lay beside her, the beam flickering weakly. She was shaking, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no sign of Chris, no sign of whatever had taken him. "What happened?" Alex shouted, running to her side. "He's gone," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw him, but it wasn't him. It was something else." The ground beneath them began to tremble, a deep, resonant rumble that came from the earth itself. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees leaning closer, the air thick with the smell of rotting earth. The graves were waking. The souls beneath the ground, forgotten, angry, were rising. Suddenly, Mike let out a sharp gasp, his flashlight pointing toward the ground. "Look!" They all turned to see the dirt beneath their feet shifting, moving as if something was pushing up from below. Cracks appeared in the earth, and through those cracks, pale, skeletal hands began to reach out, fingers grasping at the air, clawing their way to the surface. "They're coming," Rachel whispered, her voice hollow with terror. "We need to go." But there was no escape. The hands reached for them, pulling at their legs, their feet sinking into the soft earth. The ground seemed to open up beneath them, swallowing them whole. The air was filled with whispers now, the voices of the dead rising from the earth, calling to them, claiming them. Rachel struggled, her heart racing, but the hands were too strong, the earth too soft. She could feel herself being pulled down into the cold, dark ground, the whispers growing louder, the air growing colder. And then, as the last flicker of firelight died, there was only darkness. The forgotten dead had risen, and the forest reclaimed what had once been its own.